Most importantly, I would like to commend all of our panelists on their important work and the crucial endeavors of the organizations that they represent. In the most recent period of troubles between 1969 and 1999, thousands of people died in the conflict in Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 put a formal end to the violence and contained important provisions on the disarmament and demobilization of armed groups, policing, human rights, the demilitarization of British security forces, and the status of prisoners. And while the security situation has greatly improved since the agreement, and impressive progress has been made where previously there was little hope, signing a peace agreement does not automatically lead to the harmonious coexistence of war-torn communities. It does not always bring justice for all those who suffered or punishment for all the perpetrators of violence. It does not magically heal the survivors and communities' deep psychological and physical wounds. The absence of war, however important, is just the first step on the long and difficult road towards achieving genuine peace and reconstruction. It is complicated by the divergent narratives of the warring sides, power imbalances, and a legacy of prejudice and mistrust. Yet taking this road is essential. If we harbor hope for long-lasting peace built on the foundations of recognition of and accountability for the past, cross-community trust in the present, and a just vision for the future. There are many volatile communities in the world that are currently looking to Northern Ireland as an example of overcoming a long-lasting bloody conflict. Each context is different, with its own history and struggles, yet there is so much we all can learn from the challenges and successes of the peace process in Northern Ireland, the least of which is that it happened and its implementation continues to move forward. That is why it is so important to take a critical look at what has been done, and what has been done well, and what could have been done differently, and what could be done better, and to evaluate efforts for moving forward. Today's panelists work at the forefront of many crucial aspects of Northern Ireland's peace process, and I welcome the critical analysis of the progress toward peace that has been achieved in the 16 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed, an assessment of efforts to carry out transitional justice, and their views on gaps in victims' access to truth, justice, and support. Basically, we want to know what is the status of and the challenges facing peace and human rights in Northern Ireland today. And let me just go, before I kind of yield the floor, let me just go back to one point that I made earlier here, and that is, this peace process, is still going forward, and there's still challenges. But you are the example for so many parts of the world that are looking to find ways out of their own violent situations. And I met with a group of people from Ireland and from the United Kingdom yesterday about talking about how Colombia can learn from some of the from your example. I've been around the world to a lot of different places and seen a lot of different conflicts, and the older I get, I used to think things would be a lot more clear to me. The older I get more confused. I don't know what that means. Maybe it's an early sign of senility. But the point of the matter is, it is always hard for me to figure out why there are some people who justify their entire existence by highlighting their differences with others. And somehow you are overcoming that. There's still problems. There's still and there's still disagreements. But I hope and pray for your success, because at the end of the day, I want people to know that peace is possible. And if more people believe that, maybe the world will be a better place. So I thank you here during this kind of St. Patrick's Week and for being here, and look forward to having you address this audience. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you, Congressman, and to thank you again for coming. Before I turn over to the panel, I want to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Lee, and I'll leave the further discussion in her competent hands.
I guess I want to begin by thanking the Commission for inviting us for this very important briefing. Thank Representative McGovern and Representative Wolf and their staffs for the important work that they're doing with the Commission and welcoming us, and for those important remarks, and also for Dr. Katja Migacheva for all that she's done to put this together. It's my honor to serve as the chair of the moderate today, and I'm going to just take a moment to do a brief introduction to everyone who you're going to hear from. They'll have a chance to share their views for about 10 minutes apiece, and then we will move towards questions and engagement with them. So thanks to the audience for being here as well. On my far right is Alice Weiss, researcher in the European team of Amnesty International. She's carried out extensive research in Northern Ireland, focusing on accountability for past human rights violations and abuses, and she authored the Amnesty International report called Northern Ireland, Time to Deal with the Past, which was released this past September. Next to her is Brian Gormley, Director of the Committee on the Administration of Justice and a member of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Consortium. And that group is a broad-based coalition of civic society campaigning for the Northern Ireland Bill of Rights in fulfillment of the commitment made in the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement. The Committee on the Administration of Justice is an independent human rights organization, and it has cross-community membership in Northern Ireland. Next to him is Sean Pender, and he's representing Relatives for Justice. He's on the USA Advisory Board. He's also state president for the New Jersey Ancient Order of Hibernians.
Commission for organising this event and allowing us all the opportunity to speak to you about Northern Ireland and where things are today. I've been asked to just very briefly give a very short overview of the context of the violence in Northern Ireland for those of you who don't know. Hopefully that will just take me a couple of minutes. It's already been highlighted, but basically from the late 1960s to the signing of the 98 agreement, Northern Ireland experienced a very long, protracted period of political violence between Republican armed groups, Loyalist armed groups, and the UK security forces. This left more than 3,600 people killed as a result, and many of those cases have been unresolved. People have not been held accountable, and the truth has not been known. Over 40,000 people have been injured to different degrees in approximately 16,000 bombings, 37,000 shootings. So as you can imagine, the violence in Northern Ireland impacted and had a relevance on everybody's life throughout that period. Human rights violations by state actors and abuses by armed groups were perpetrated by all sides. Abuses included killings, abductions, shootings, torture, ill treatment. Again, in the majority of those cases, no one has ever been held accountable. The signing of the 1998 Good Friday Belfast Agreement really did signal a turning point in the history of Northern Ireland, and there's no doubt that 15 years, almost 16 now, of relative peace, there has been real progress towards moving towards a more peaceful future. And in taking on the huge and important work of building new political institutions, the Good Friday and the agreements that came afterwards did not provide the tools or create the bodies or processes to fully grapple with the pain, the anger, and the hurt that are inevitably the legacy of decades of violence and conflict. This failure to deal with Northern Ireland's difficult and troubled past has had huge consequences, both for individuals and for societies at large. At the individual level, decades after their relatives were killed and 15 years of relative peace, many families from across the communities in Northern Ireland are still searching for justice, are still searching for truth. They are still asking questions: why did a loved one die? What were the circumstances of their death? And why was no one held accountable? And many people feel that after 15 years they should be able to get answers to those questions. But the legacy of the past is affecting not just individual victims, but society as a whole. The failure to grapple with it creates fertile ground for continued division and continued mistrust, and this can only undermine progress towards a peaceful and shared future. So in 2012, Amnesty International took the opportunity of the then impending 15 years anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement to really examine what mechanisms and processes have been put in place to investigate past human rights violations and past human rights abuses. We released a report, and there's some copies on the side, in September 2012. Now this report examines the mechanisms that are in place in Northern Ireland to investigate past violations and abuses. In particular, the Historical Inquiries Team, which people will probably refer to as the HET, the Police Ombudsman's Office, the Police Service of Northern Ireland and their criminal investigations, coroner inquiries, public inquiries. And we really were looking at these mechanisms in light of international law. Are they delivering effective investigations? Are they delivering for victims? Are they delivering truth, justice and accountability? Unfortunately, after our research, we were deeply disappointed by what we found. Throughout the year that we were doing the research, we spoke with families who had lost relatives in the conflict from across different communities. And while each and every person has their own story and their own perspective, there was a common call for political leaders in Northern Ireland and in the UK and in Ireland to give greater priority for victims' quest for truth, for justice, for acknowledgement and for support. The central overarching finding of our research is that the approach to dealing with the past in Northern Ireland is not adequate. It's let victims down far too often and critically does not fulfil human rights obligations of the United Kingdom. As a result, Amnesty has been calling for a comprehensive mechanism to deal with the past in Northern Ireland, and I'll come on to some detail about what we think that should look like. So our research really identified two key problems with the current approach to investigation in Northern Ireland. The first was at the level of the individual mechanisms that have been established to directed to investigate past violations and abuses. Victims and families reported a range of experiences with the mechanisms. Some individuals got good reports and gained some satisfaction from them. However, by and large, the majority of those we talked to felt let down, and by and large the investigations were failing to fulfil basic standards of independence, impartiality, thoroughness and effectiveness. Furthermore, repeated investigative failures across the different mechanisms has undermined confidence and trust in their ability to get to the truth. So for a lot of families, a lot of victims, they are moving from mechanism to mechanism, each time getting a little bit of information from it, but never getting the whole picture and never getting the whole story. But for us, the second and perhaps more pressing point is even if the mechanisms that exist in Northern Ireland to investigate the past were working in full compliance with their mandates, they are simply not sufficient to deliver truth and justice. It is a piecemeal, fragmented approach that has been taken that simply can't provide the comprehensive picture that is needed of all of the violations and all of the abuses that took place. As a result, in Northern Ireland, much of the truth about the past has remained hidden, and those in positions of responsibility have remained shielded. These limitations have also contributed to a failure to develop a shared public understanding and recognition of the abuses committed by all sides. There are a number of problems that I would like to highlight. For example, the near singular focus on killings by these mechanisms has meant that people who were seriously injured as a result of the conflict, or people who were tortured and ill-treated, have essentially been excluded from the mechanisms to deal with the past. So their stories, what happened to them, there is no acknowledgement of their suffering and there is no truth and justice for them, even though what has happened to them is as much as the story of what has happened in the conflict, and they also deserve the opportunity to gain truth and justice. In addition, the mechanism's focus on individual cases has really limited the possibility for an examination of patterns of abuses and violations that occurred during the conflict. For example, although armed groups were responsible for the vast majority of deaths and other human rights abuses, details of their operations remain sometimes unclear and under-investigated. There needs to be a much more thorough, comprehensive approach to the investigation of abuses by armed groups, their institutional culture, their policies, their practices. And where there is solid evidence, those allegedly responsible for crimes need to be brought before a fair trial. The role and actions of state bodies and agencies have also not been subject to effective investigation in Northern Ireland. There hasn't been sufficient scrutiny of the investigation of state-sanctioned practice and whether they deliberately or indirectly gave rise to unlawful conduct. A clear example of that is state collusion with Republican and loyalist armed groups. This is a critical issue that has yet to be fully addressed by the existing mechanisms, and as a result, the truth is hidden, the degree, the level of collusion remains obscured. Even in the few cases where the government has acknowledged that collusion took place, the Papua-Nuclean case being a clear example of this, families still do not have the full truth, and no one in high levels of government have ever been held properly accountable. Our report concludes that an overarching mechanism needs to be established to deal with the past in a comprehensive manner. We emphasise that it should be victim-focused and empowered to investigate individual cases, patterns of abuses and violations, and where evidence exists, people should be brought to justice. It needs to have teeth. It needs to be able to do the job properly, so it needs powers to compel witnesses, to compel documents, and it needs to be able to make recommendations for reparation. We believe such a mechanism would be an important step towards the currently existing environment of impunity that we see in Northern Ireland, and it would allow for public recognition and understanding of the harm inflicted by all sides, and possibly set the stage for healing. Now, many of you may know that in September 2013, the 5 executive parties in Northern Ireland began talks chaired by Dr. Richard Haass in relation to 3 issues of contention there, including how to deal with the past. Although there was no final agreement reached by the end of the year, Amnesty International believes that the Haass proposals on dealing with the past, specifically the proposals to establish the Historical Investigation Unit, are a positive step forward. The proposals will need to be refined to ensure that they comply fully with human rights standards, i.e. that whatever is established is independent and effective, but they importantly provide a solid basis from which to proceed with efforts to deliver truth and justice. However, and crucially, the draft proposals at the moment remain just that. They are draft proposals. It is crucial that all the stakeholders in a peaceful Northern Ireland do not let yet another opportunity for progress to slip by due to lack of political will and vision. The Haass proposals represent a sensible, forward-looking approach with the promise to deliver truth and justice. But we are deeply concerned that the Haass proposals are going to be held hostage to the lack of agreement on other contentious and sensitive issues, or fall victim to inaction in the face of other disagreements between the parties. Amnesty International has been urging the Northern Ireland political parties to take forward the proposals as a matter of priority. But importantly, the UK and the Irish governments also have a role to play. In particular, the UK government has obligations under international law to ensure effective independent investigations into past violations. That's an obligation that they can't simply try and avoid or sidestep or leave to the Northern Ireland political parties. And then in relation to the United States, the US was, as you all know, a crucial key actor in helping broker the Good Friday Agreement and remains to this day one of the custodians of the peace in Northern Ireland. We believe that the US government and the US political actors have an incredibly important role to play at this critical juncture. We are urging all of those friends of Northern Ireland among you to call for real and substantial progress on delivering a comprehensive, human rights compliant, effective approach to the past. It's the Haass Agreement itself emphasises that the time to rise to the challenge of the past is now, because Northern Ireland does not have the luxury of putting off this difficult but potentially transformative task anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice Weiss. Ryan Gormley, please.
Thank you very much. May I thank the Lantos Commission for the invitation to contribute to this briefing today. As our moderator has described what the organisations I'm representing do, I'll maybe just avoid the time that I would have spent doing that, make a couple of introductory remarks. Alice mentioned the nature of the conflict and how devastating it was to Northern Ireland. To put it in context, if you extrapolated the figures from the number killed and wounded, 3,600 killed in Northern Ireland out of a population of 1.5 million, if you extrapolated that to the United States, it would be the equivalent impact of 8 9/11s every single year for 30 years. So you can see the intensity of the conflict in terms of the impact on Northern Ireland. But it's not just the nature of the conflict that makes Northern Ireland still important, but the nature of the peace process. And as Congressman McGovern said, our peace process is held up as a model for other conflicts around the world. And it's our firm view that if our process is going to be held up as a model, then we've got to get it right. And at the moment, it's not right. Again, a little bit of context though. We cannot and wouldn't wish to in any sense deny the massive strides that have been made in Northern Ireland since 1998. A few weeks ago, on the 12th of February actually, I was privileged to host a lecture on the 25th anniversary of the murder of Pat Finucane in Queen's University in Belfast. And the lecture was given by Mr. Justice Seamus Tracy, a High Court judge. And I said in my introduction to him that the fact that a lecture commemorating Pat Finucane's murder was being given by a leading member of the Northern Ireland judiciary showed how far we have come. The fact that there has still not been a public inquiry into that murder shows how far we still have to go. And it's a problem that we have to come here yet again and say that Northern Ireland is again in crisis. 2 weeks ago, the First Minister threatened to resign over letters of comfort given by the UK government to some Republicans who thought themselves wanted by police. Prior to that, as you know, the all-party talks chaired by Dr. Richard Haass failed to come to agreement on contentious issues that themselves threaten the peace. And all this is against the backdrop of serious street violence which erupted some 18 months or more ago now over flags and emblems. There is increasing recruitment, particularly by loyalist paramilitaries, and a continuing threat from dissident Republicans who've not abandoned the path of violence. Now, in CAJ's view, the instability in the peace process is actually due to the rollback of human rights commitments made in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the other pacts that made up the peace settlement. And in particular, the failure to deal with the violations and crimes of the past keeps disrupting the present and threatening the future of our society. The letters that I made reference to so-called on-the-runs, people who were on the run from the police, or they thought they were, is itself an issue of the past, or failing to deal with the past. And it is a very good example of the way failure to deal with the past threatens both the present and the future. And I mentioned the rollback of human rights. And this includes commitments made as part of the settlement which have never been implemented, and areas where institutional and policy gains were made which are now being undermined. One of the most important unimplemented commitments is, of course, the Fundamental Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. That is the single biggest gap in the human rights provisions of the agreement, and as well as the particular political arrangements that the agreement set in place. The fundamental characteristic of our peace agreement was the human rights framework that it established, and the Bill of Rights was meant to be the keystone of that human rights architecture. Also unimplemented were commitments to a Single Equality Act and an Irish Language Act, the introduction of an anti-poverty strategy, lack of full implementation of statutory equality duties, and the promise to repeal emergency law, as is not unusual in British administrations. The emergency laws were repealed to be replaced by a permanent law which contained all the relevant provisions. Some commitments, like the right of women to full and equal political participation and supporting young people from areas affected by conflict, have never had a delivery mechanism to take them forward. There's been regression in commitments to victim services, a drift away from promises to tackle inequality on the basis of objective need, and the pledge to remove employment barriers for ex-prisoners. There is a current threat by some British politicians to the Human Rights Act, which, in accordance with a pledge in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law. The casual attempt by some Tory politicians to do away with that legislation in a kind of anti-European mood would knock away one of the major pillars of the human rights architecture of the agreement. We've also seen the slow pace of some justice reform and the undermining of the independence of key peace settlement institutions, such as occurred during the tenure of the second police ombudsman. Policing also has seen rollback from the blueprint of a rights-based and accountable service, most notably in the 2007 transfer of the most controversial area of policing, so-called national security, covert policing, away from the Police Service of Northern Ireland and its oversight bodies to the Secret Security Service, MI5, which now has primacy for national security policing. There were some areas of human rights-related policy which were not dealt with by the agreements, including a transitional justice mechanism to deal with the past, and notably one prominent related commitment in the agreements to hold a public inquiry into the murder of human rights lawyer Pat Finucane has been reneged on. In fact, the failure to deal with the past, as it's put, is a failure by the UK state to honour its obligations under the right to life, to properly investigate all unlawful deaths, especially those where state agents might have been involved. However, the crisis, if you like, in the peace process led the Northern Ireland parties to ask Dr. Richard Haass to come over to Northern Ireland and lead all-party talks on some of these contentious issues. And in spite of the failure of the Northern Ireland parties to agree on a final report, the text produced by Dr. Haass and Megan O'Sullivan, the so-called proposed agreement, has made a massive contribution to the situation, in our view. The proposed agreement said, the past continues to permeate our government, institutions and people. It creates mistrust among leaders at all levels of society. It maintains the gulf between neighbours who pass each other in the street or in the shops. The document also stresses that Northern Ireland does not have the luxury of putting off this difficult but potentially transformative task any longer. So, although the political parties wouldn't in the end sign up to it, the Haass proposed agreement put forward a single investigative body to deal with all conflict-related killings and serious injuries. It also proposed a parallel truth discovery mechanism. Though not perfect, these proposals are, in our view, compliant with human rights standards and would make a massive contribution to exposing past crimes and violations of human rights and thus stabilising our present society. In conclusion, I want to stress again that what happens in Northern Ireland matters to the United States and the rest of the world. The conflict devastated Northern Ireland, a region within the boundaries of a major Western European and G8 power. But the peace process was largely based on a human rights framework. Insofar as there is instability, it is because of the rollback of human rights. Insofar as there is continuing violence, it is because of the lack of legitimacy and the sense of fairness that a consistent human rights-based approach would bring. The lesson that human rights can build peace out of war and can bring peace in a divided community needs to be fully learned in Northern Ireland in order to prove its relevance to other conflicts. So we call, therefore, on all friends of Northern Ireland and of human rights worldwide to help us halt and reverse the rollback of the human rights framework from our peace process. We ask you to influence the UK government and the Northern Ireland political parties to hold a full public inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane, legislate for the Haass proposals on investigating conflict-related killings and injuries, fully implement the outstanding commitments in the peace agreements, and guarantee the human rights framework and underlying values of the peace settlement by passing a strong and inclusive Bill of Rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian Garland. And now, Sean Pender, please.
Thank you very much. First, I want to take the opportunity to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for the opportunity this morning to offer testimony on behalf of the dedicated staff of Relatives for Justice, and more importantly, in behalf of the families and the victims that they represent. After Her Majesty's Inspectorate of the Constabulary issued a damning report in July of 2013 regarding the Police Service of Northern Ireland's Historical Inquiries Team, or HET, it exposed the deliberately flawed and illegal approach to how the state, to reviewing the state killings in which British soldiers had continued impunity for their actions. Relatives to Justice then held a hearing of meetings with families who engaged with the HET. These were relatives of people killed by the state and non-state actors to the conflict. There was 4 large meetings which were held across the north, where several hundred families were consulted on a way forward in dealing with the past. These families were still seeking answers, truth, acknowledgement, recognition, and justice. Only a very small number wanted prosecutions. The vast majority wanted validation of their experiences that had so wrecked their lives, replacing years of vilification for standing up and daring to speak out, for breaking silence and telling the unspeakable truth contrary to the narrative of the status quo. They wanted an international, independent process of truth recovery in which they, for the first time, trust. This comes after decades of cover-up. They also unanimously stated that the PSNI, or the Police Service of Northern Ireland, should not investigate the past, and that in the absence of an official independent truth process, that RFJ lobby, campaign, and engage in strategic litigation opportunities for the creation of Article 2 compliant mechanisms of investigations. Of course, all of these action points occur as a result of families facing huge obstacles, including delay and denial, in which the state uses its sovereignty as a shield, preventing truth, inquiry, and the examination of the past. And at the same time, the state promotes the cause of those bereaved by non-state actors, notably anti-state forces, and those also killed who were members of state forces. This artificial hierarchy is also politically convenient and serves only to deepen divisions, and at times pitches the rights of one set of victims against the other, which is totally wrong. Of course, the state knows that while these divisions and tensions exist, they create distractions from the central argument that everyone is entitled to the same truth, the same justice, and that these rights are universal and not exclusive. One does not cancel out the other. Violations are violations, no matter who the perpetrator. Recognizing this difficulty, in 2013, as mentioned before, the Northern Ireland Executive invited Dr. Haass and Professor O'Sullivan to examine 3 key areas: flags, marches, and the past. That same year, we also had 2 significant rulings from the international community concerning state killings. In May, there was a report by the United Nations Committee Against Torture stating that the past had to be dealt with and that specifically an inquiry into the murder of human rights defender Pat Finucane should be established. In July, the European Court on Human Rights made commentary in a scathing judgment on the SAS killings of Desi McGrew and Martin McGahey, in that an inordinate amount of the investigative delays equated to a form of state impunity. Relatives for Justice welcomed and engaged with the Haass-O'Sullivan consultation. We made a comprehensive written submission and met Professor O'Sullivan. We also supported and empowered families to make their own submissions. We thank Dr. Haass, Professor O'Sullivan, and their team for their committed work, detailed and thoroughly extensive recommendations, and especially their time over the holiday period away from their families in seeking to have proposals successfully agreed to. Such agreement would in itself be a form of symbolic reparation for all those who were so hurt by the conflict. We still hold on to the hope. In respect to the past, the proposals by Haass and O'Sullivan represent a compromise by all, and as such represent the best way forward. The proposed Historical Investigation Unit, the HIU, when measured, contains the potential to meet the general terms of the objectives set by Relatives for Justice. In principle, this unit would see that the HET, or Historical Inquiries Team, would go, and the intended spirit would ensure that the PSN&I would not investigate the past. The unit would be operationally independent with full police powers, and the emphasis for us was that it would be Article 2 compliant. The creation of the Historical Investigations Unit would also see the retrospective legacy remit of the Police Ombudsman's Office move to the newly formed Historical Investigations Unit. For us, too, this made sense, but there's been a hollowing out of the Ombudsman's Office by interest coupled with the deliberate holding of resources to address the current backlog of cases. This is about lessening its potential, about furthering the truth. There's been much commentary and politics surrounding the proposals, but when all is said and done, there still remains a legal obligation on the state to investigate in a compliant way state direct killings, including where allegations and evidence of collusion exist. The proposals work for all victims of the conflict inclusively. No one is excluded. This represents a positive step forward. With that state obligation foremost, Relatives for Justice also took into account the task of the Policing Board in its role in implementing the recommendations of the HMIC concerning the Historical Inquiries Team, which still remains to be resolved after the July 2013 findings. For Relatives for Justice, the Historical Inquiries Team and the PSNI cannot meet Article 2 compliant process on investigating the past. It is precisely because they have policed the past that we find ourselves constantly litigating or having the Policing Board force a situation into which the HMIC were called in. This form of political control within the police service of Northern Ireland by vested interests is equally having a negative effect on the advances of civic policing. The proposals by Dr. Haass and Professor O'Sullivan, in our view, also address these issues whereby the toxic nature of the past is neutralized concerning its ability to affect other transitional institutions. Ames and Bradley also recognize this. Even if the proposals are not implemented in full, the Policing Board, politicians, and both governments should at the very least measure the value and potential of the HIU in meeting the state's legal obligation and the needs of families. In the absence of a political agreement, Relatives for Justice believes that's where the focus needs to be, and urge all with influence, both internally within the North and externally, internationally, to bring to bear that influence in a positive and constructive way for the greater number of those bereaved and injured from across all the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean Pender. And now, please, Anne Cadwalladr.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking us here today to speak about our experiences and beliefs on resolving the pressing need in Northern Ireland to address the past. What I'm going to try and do, but with the use of the slides on the wall here, is to show you some of the truth that we've discovered and how we've discovered it and how it's helped families understand what happened to their loved ones in the past What we've done is far from perfect, but I think it does show a little of what is possible. First of all, just a few words about us. We're non-party political. We'll work on anyone's behalf. Other groups rightly focus on human rights abuses by paramilitary groups, such as those who had disappeared during conflict, sympathises with the aims of the UDA, and the UDA was the largest paramilitary organisation that was carrying out sectarian murders. This is a bit like saying that members of the US National Guard were sympathetic with others who were killing people. We made significant discoveries during our research. For example, this document shows that the British government knew as long ago as 1973, and this is the British government's own figures, so they're likely to be higher, that between 5 and 15% of all members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, that's a British Army regiment, will also be active members of these paramilitary groups, the UDA, the others that you can see there listed. And they knew, even then, that there would be a passing on of information between state forces and paramilitary groups and training methods, and that subversives, that is, active loyalists within the Ulster Defence Regiment, would leak weapons and ammunition to Protestant extremist groups. So they knew even in 1973 that their own British Army was training and arming loyalist killers. This shows how far up the chain of knowledge went. This is an account of a meeting between the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the newly elected leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher, in 1975. And as you can see there, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Merlin Rees, told Mrs Thatcher and his own Prime Minister that there were elements in the police, that's the Royal Ulster Constabulary, who were very close to the UVF. That's one of the main loyalist paramilitary groups who were actively killing people at that time, and who were prepared to hand over information to them and to, for example, Mr Paisley. And it says that the British Army's own judgment was that the Ulster Defence Regiment, that's one of its own regiments, at the time the largest regiment in the British Army, was heavily infiltrated by extremist Protestants. This is a table showing how ballistic evidence can be used to link different attacks. Families have found out for the first time through our work that their loved one was killed by a weapon that was also used to kill other people. That allows them to see their own loss, their own family history, as part of a bigger history. And we've actually introduced families to each other who have never met before, who have been bereaved by the same weapon. And we've held church services to link those families to each other so they get some kind of form of consolation, so they can see some pattern, some link between themselves and others. This was the largest single day of killing in Northern Ireland in May 1974, the 40th anniversary is this year. 34 people died in 3 car bombings in Dublin and 1 in Monaghan. The Irish government set up, although it was deeply flawed, it did set up an inquiry into all these murders, and it was able to give the families some validation, some acknowledgement, some sense that their loss was being recognised. And it also allowed the Pat Finucane Centre to draw ballistic links between, ballistic and other perpetrator links, between these attacks and others that we were investigating. We found, for example, the depth of deception that families were treated to at that time is shown in this document, in which we can see that within 10 days of the largest single loss of life in the entire conflict, within 10 days, the British government was holding secret talks with those responsible for the bombings. The sort of thing that, I mean, if you can imagine after Omagh that the British would hold talks with the dissident real IRA, it's unthinkable. But at that time, they were speaking to leaders of the UVF who'd carried out the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, and indeed, as the underlined words in red show, they intended to influence whether or not people who were suspected of murder would be investigated and arrested. Another important aspect we've discovered through our investigation is that the government knew at the time that arms were being routinely, month by month by month, they were disappearing from state armories, from Ulster Defence Regiment armories, and were being used to murder people. The words outlined in red there, circled in red, include the word collusion. The word collusion crops up in official British government documents way before it was being used in terms of the Pat Finucane murder, for example. It crops up time after time. It was used routinely. The British government knew, even in the early 70s, that there was collusion in murder, but they didn't admit this or indeed do anything about it. And of course, all these policies have a human price. These three men paid that price. They were used in they were murdered by a gun taken from a UDR armory. To take one of the guns, one of the many dozens of guns taken. The same gun was used to kill the father of my colleague, Alan Bracknell, who's in the room here with us today. The HET was indeed flawed, as other speakers have said, but it showed what was possible, the kind of revelations that families could get, given goodwill, integrity, and ability, and access to official documents that are kept under lock and key that NGOs such as ourselves do not have access to. One example here is that a particular bombing in August 1975 in County Armagh. We know now, because of the HET's report, that things that the families would never have been told otherwise. The bomb car used was taken from an RUC officer. The bomb was made by a second RUC officer. The explosives were provided by a member of the British Army. The bomb was stored at the home of an RUC officer. His home was put under surveillance by the British Army, but the surveillance was lifted. The bomb route was scouted by an RUC officer, and the surveillance having been lifted, the bombing went ahead. Afterwards, although the RUC Special Branch knew everything about the killers and the bomb gang involved, they did not arrest anyone or question anyone, although they had all the names. And of course, that kind of duplicity and deception has a price, and these are the people who paid that price. Elizabeth MacDonald, the mother of 3 children, one of whom was blown out of his cot and was found in the rubble crying over her dead body, and Gerard McLean, a 22-year-old man who was crossing the road for a pint of beer that night and who was killed with a shard of metal through his heart by part of the bomb car. They paid the price for these policies. There's also the importance of commentary. Analysis and commentary is important as well as facts. So speaking about the step-in bombing that we've just been hearing about, the HET says there's no reason or rationale anywhere in the papers examined for leaving the bomb unrecovered. Then the HET speculates it could have been a speculative decision on the part of the police, but whatever the rationale for it was, the HET concludes it was a huge gamble which went catastrophically wrong, resulting in the deaths of 2 people. The HET also attributes blame, blame in this case is probably the right word actually. It points in the direction where action should have been taken and wasn't taken. And it says in this report into the murders of 2 men who were killed on their way home from a Gaelic athletic match in Dublin. They were stopped by a false UDR patrol and murdered on the side of the road. It says that there had been indisputable evidence just a month earlier of loyalist paramilitary collusion in one case, followed by significant evidence of further cooperation weeks later. And this is the critical bit. This should have rung alarm bells all the way to the top of government. Nothing was done. The murderous cycle continued. So, in the absence of a comprehensive process, as the other speakers have indicated, The PFC did do everything we could to put together the truth as far as we could find it in these 120 deaths that we examined, 1/3 of which were in the Republic. We found they were all carried out by permutations of the same gang, that the gang had systemic links with both police and British soldiers, that it was infiltrated by special branch agents, and that its members were protected from the courts. We then published a book at the end of last year, called Lethal Allies, British Collusion in Ireland, which validated the family's untold story and uncovered the facts that we had discovered. And I'm glad to say it's become a bestseller, and the families that we wrote it for are very pleased with it. It has given them something of the truth. They were bereaved, then they were deceived. We have managed to find something of their truth, and it indicates how important and how worthwhile such a process could be. So looking to the future, like the others who've talked, we believe that all families deserve and need the truth. We believe the HET was flawed and wasn't Article 2 compliant, that the Haass proposals are a possible way for a new process forward, and although they were a compromise, we believe that independence and giving them the new processes police powers would be critically important. We also believe that the families bereaved in the Republic and Britain should be included, not just those in Northern Ireland. So that is an idea of what is in the files, what is locked up, what is not being revealed and has not been revealed to families, but is potentially there to try and heal their wounds. At least they cannot hope for justice at this point. They will never get justice for what happened to them. But they can at least be accorded the dignity, the human dignity, of being given as much as possible of the truth about what has devastated their lives. It's possible, it can be done, it should be done, it must be done now. And we appeal to American public opinion and political opinion to use every possible channel of influence to convince the parties in Northern Ireland and the two governments involved not to wait any longer, not to wait until any more people have died without the truth, and to push for the Haass proposals to be implemented quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, Cuddle, and Letty. I think it falls to me now, the plan that we made, to try to provide a little bit of a summary of some of the themes of what we've heard, and then we'll move to some questions. But I do want to thank all of our experts for their own testimony, and I know they're standing with many people behind them who have done a tremendous amount of work to bring this forward. I guess one of the phrases that comes to mind after listening to all of this and from my familiarity with the context is that there continues to be what we might call a double injustice that has occurred. So the violation of human rights, and then the lack of investigating and addressing them. And that seemed to be a theme that I heard throughout each of those, and that double injustice continues. It impacts individuals who are injured or witnessed such tragedies and violations, and also clearly families. But we also heard about how it impacts society, and I think that was another thing we were hearing as well, that if we would summarize it as kind of a two-level process, there are individual needs, there are family needs, but also there's a societal need. So we want to keep that in mind as we look at the other themes. It also appears quite evident from our testimonies today that the mechanisms that are in place have not engendered trust in the way that the state or states are addressing the past, particularly regarding human rights abuses, but the past in general, even beyond that. That is piecemeal, it's disconnected, It leaves both victims and society without a comprehensive sense of both addressing the past and also moving forward, and that has created ongoing not only instability, but also, as Brian Gormley mentioned, really a rollback of previous commitments as well. The mechanisms that are in place, we've heard from those who have spoken that there are serious flaws in the fact that they are not human rights compliant with either UK laws or international laws and standards as well. There's reference to Article 2, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but since this is being recorded for others, I guess I'll also just state that refers to the European Court of Human Rights article on human rights. So the failing to deal with the past, it seems one of the other themes is this lack of justice has an impact on the moving forward of the future, since families, in a way, the past is the present, but the same is the case for society in general. We heard effectively, I think, the beginning of a conversation that perhaps will continue shortly about what is needed as we move forward. One is, I think we heard a repeated theme about needing a comprehensive approach to dealing with the past, one that in which either the mechanism or each mechanism that's connected is human rights compliant. The other thing I guess I would bring out is it seems as though there's an interest across the board in addressing human rights issues, which matches human rights laws, for every person, no matter what their background is or what their involvement was in the circumstances in this jurisdiction. But in particular, that there is a call to hold the state accountable for playing the lead role in making sure that what is occurring on the ground, both of the mechanisms and how they're carried out, is human rights compliant, as well as holding, shining a light on state behavior. And as we heard from our last speaker, perhaps a lack of intervention, both interventions and the lack of intervention by state behavior. And I also think we heard a theme that the U.S. in particular, as well as the international community in general, has a stake in this outcome. This is not merely an opportunity to share something that is a struggle for people who are deeply involved, but also to say that the U.S. has a stake as a leader in helping to promote the development of a peace process and the development of justice and accountability and the development of the Good Friday Agreement, that the United States has a particular stake in seeing that the processes are put into place that are human rights compliant. So I hope that that helps to provide a little bit of a summary after we've heard quite a bit of detail as well. And I thought I'd start us off with a question for the panelists and then welcome people from the floor to ask questions. We'd love to hear what you're wondering about as well. I wonder if, this is for the entire panel, so you're all welcome to briefly answer, or whoever would like to come forward on this, but I wonder if you could speak a little further about what you think the roles are for the governments as well as the political parties. So let me be more specific. How would you see the role now for addressing the lack of compliance, for addressing human rights violations, and at this point, the lack of a comprehensive approach that has been accepted and implemented for dealing with the past? What is the role for the British and Irish governments? And what roles do you see for the political parties in that jurisdiction?
I'll start as I'm on the end and everyone seems to be looking at me to start. So all of them have actually a critical role. I think if I start with the UK government, it is crucial that the UK government does not forget that under international law it has clear obligations to ensure effective investigations. There has been a disappointing tendency from the UK government to, I guess, suggest that it can take a back seat, that it can sit to one side while others discuss and debate and come to consensus. But that's fundamentally ignoring or trying to avoid its responsibility to make sure that the UK is fulfilling its human rights obligations. So I think, from our perspective, the role of the UK government to date has been disappointing, to say the least. We can do numerous examples of refusal to do inquiries, Patrick Finucane, the Omar bombing, but also generally not to really step up to the plate to recognise its obligations, and to really play a key role in driving the process forward, to ensuring and promising sufficient resources, to ensuring that any mechanism established can have also access to, for example, a mechanism established in Northern Ireland would need access to documents held in London, in Westminster, held by security services, by the army and so on. So Westminster also has a crucial role for that regard. So I think we can't underestimate the need for the UK government to really step up to the plate at this point. And that's crucial. With regards to the Irish government, I think I'm going to end up repeating myself because they also have an important role to play. In our report, we clearly call for the Irish government to support the establishment of a comprehensive mechanism and to provide full cooperation to that. That would include, where necessary, passing legislation so that documents could be accessed also in the Republic of Ireland. So the Irish government likewise needs to actually help drive the process forward. The Northern Ireland political parties, they need to get back around the table and actually come to an agreement in relation to the Haass proposals. Importantly, they need, as I mentioned, there's the fear that the talks on the past will be held hostage by the lack of agreement on other issues, by the on-the-runs discussion that Brian has also referenced. Dr. Richard Haass on Tuesday made it clear that there is no excuse to use these other things to prevent us from dealing with the past. And I think that is a message that we want the Northern Ireland political parties to hear, that these other disagreements, these other contentious issues cannot be used as an excuse to prevent victims and their families finally having access to the truth, access to mechanisms in which they can trust, and in which they can have confidence. They've been let down consistently, both at the time of the violations and in the decades since, and there can't be another opportunity where we see it happen again. So in terms of the role, all three aspects, all three parties really have a considerable way to go and a considerably important role to play.
Well, if I'm next in line, yeah, I concur with everything that Alice has said. Let me just emphasise the role of the UK government. Some people may think that with the devolution of justice and policing, then all responsibility for those areas rests with the local administration in Belfast. But in fact, anything connected with national security is reserved to Westminster. And their definition of national security is very elastic, but amongst other things includes all records before devolution, all records held by state agencies. Now, it's impossible to have an effective mechanism to deal with the past without those records and those papers being available. So the UK government keeps shuffling off responsibility. Oh, well, there's got to be consensus amongst the political parties in Northern Ireland. Our hands are tied. I mean, it's nonsense, actually, because unless they're fully engaged in a process of leading dialogue designed to get agreement and leading it in the right way, then there can never be a solution that's going to be effective. I mean, my organisation is so convinced of the bad faith of the UK government in these matters that when we look at the existing mechanisms that are supposed to deal with the past, we're actually coming to describe them as the apparatus of impunity. They're not designed to find the truth, they're designed to cover up the truth in the interests of the impunity of state agents. And that's not just about the past in Northern Ireland, it's about the more recent past in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and it's about the future. They want state agents to be able to commit crimes without ever being brought to justice. And that's what's at stake in the question of dealing with the past in Northern Ireland. breaking the culture of impunity and making the light of justice shine everywhere, not just on people who are defined as enemies of the state.
Well, I don't think I can add much more than Alice and Brian said, but maybe just offer that you see consistent themes here of the British government's inability to deal with the past. Take the time of the ceasefire prior. A whole generation of children have been brought up without a lack of violence. But you cannot hold this agreement up for other places in the world and say it's successful. That's not the case. Everyone, every office should get the testimony from Dr. Haass on Tuesday and the others and become familiar with that. And to start asking hard questions of the Irish government, the British government, and all the political parties of the North. And it comes down to basically one thing, and that's the truth. All of these people here and the groups that they work with consistently have worked with people who are looking for truth for 3 and 4 decades. In some cases, you have grandchildren trying to get the truth for their grandparents that they've never met. But what the British government and certain forces of political parties in the North will not forget, that this quest for truth will not die with this generation. The British government feels to think that if we push it off to another generation, people will forget about it. And it's simply not going to happen. The stories the victims tell us have not changed from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. The same truths they told then, they're telling now. And our government needs to bring all the players together and demand that they live up to the obligations of the Good Friday Agreement, and to not just hold it up as this very feel-good story that we can speak about on St. Patrick's Day. Hard questions need to be asked, and answers need to be demanded from the players. It's much, much too important. We can't hold this up to use the successes of it, potential successes elsewhere in the world, if we don't get this right. And don't think that they can't go back to the bad old days, because don't be naive enough to know that people on both sides, dissidents, would like to go back to that. We can't have that. We need another generation of children to grow up in the north of Ireland in peace.
What we say in the book is that the British government has apologised in the past. They apologised for Bloody Sunday. They've apologised for the Hillsborough Stadium tragedy in which 96 people were killed and the police told lies. They've apologised and held public inquiries into the institutionalised racism in the British Metropolitan Police. Now, I do understand why, even despite that, they don't want to apologise for what they did in terms of collusion, because this is worse than all that. Not only did more people die, it was more deep-rooted, it was systemic, it went to the top. So they're going to have to re-examine their own past, their own civil servants, their own previous politicians. It's big, it's difficult. However, it must be done, because, and it will be done, because there is litigation coming down the road at them. They must know that. And eventually, and it's very traumatic for families, to have to go to court, to have to seek legal aid and go to court and spend the next few decades in long, drawn-out legal processes. But if that's what it takes, that it will happen. And they cannot avoid this. They cannot wash their hands. They may try, they may want to, but in the long run, they will not be able to wash their hands of this, because people are not going away, and that litigation is going to happen. As for the Irish government, well, a couple of years ago, they cut the funding to zero of the only group in the Republic of Ireland that spoke up for the relatives of the dead. You know, we're trying to get them to reverse that decision. But both governments never like facing up to the wrongs of their predecessors. And one can understand that, but the victims aren't going away, the families aren't going away, and they might as well do the honourable thing now, hold their hands up and say, okay, let's get this sorted out.
Thank you. Can I see if there are questions, please? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Peter Kissel for the Irish American Unity Conference. I'd like the panels, any or all of you, I'd like your further views on whether an opening for criminal prosecutions is helpful or harmful to arriving at the truth. for the families. Sean, for instance, you mentioned that the relatives for justice interviews of families, very few of the families were interested in prosecution. What they want is the truth. I think we all know by now with Dr. Haass's team, their recommendation, and especially anybody who saw his excellent spellbinding testimony before the committee on Tuesday, but among his recommendations is that the criminal prosecutions be on the table. Isn't there a natural tension between prosecutions being a possibility and getting at the truth? And you know, I refer obviously to the example of South Africa, where immunity was key to getting the truth.
Change the starting line.
Can I just jump in before we go forward, because we can all see the clock? We have to vacate the room at 11, so if we keep that in mind as you decide, especially if you would like to hear another question, but I will leave it to the panel.
Well, we don't see any contradiction between a judicial process or an investigative process which is looking for evidence on which prosecutions might be based, because the evidence is what you need to look for. In many cases, it won't reach the level necessary for prosecutions, in which case, I mean, this is in the Haass proposals, then you would move on to a situation of giving what information is available to the families. And there is also a parallel process suggested whereby immunity in terms of prosecution for any evidence given to a kind of truth recovery mechanism would allow perpetrators to come forward and talk about what they did without fear of prosecution. So there's a parallel process, but first of all you've got to start down the criminal justice route. Of course, even today, there is a maximum of 2 years that you would serve in prison for any offence committed during the Troubles, and that is already in law. So there's already a kind of limited immunity from the full weight of the law. There's no reason from a human rights point of view why that 2 years couldn't be reduced to naught, so long as that was part of a transitional justice mechanism which made sure that perpetrators were held to account, if not actually punished. And I mean, I think that and the organisations that work with many victims would say that only a minority of victims want to see people do jail time. The practical problems are there. Even in any event when you're looking at offences so far in the past. But I think in general, the Haass proposals get the balance right between pursuing prosecutorial possibilities, but also creating a mechanism to gather the maximum possible information for the families or those people who were themselves injured or families of those who were killed.
I'll keep this very brief just because of the time. I mean, it's very much, in terms of the people we spoke to, yes, very much reflected that a large number are seeking truth and not justice. But there's also a sizable number who want justice. And I think importantly, a large number of those that we spoke to who actually, their key goal is truth and they're not interested in seeing someone come to trial. A lot of them also recognise the right of other people who wanted justice to have that possibility. So even though for themselves and for their family they didn't want it, they were clear that there should be the possibility, there should be an avenue for justice for those that want to go down that route. Yes, it's going to be difficult due to the time and erosion of evidence, but our position would always be that there has to be that possibility, there has to be that avenue open to do so. And as Brian said, the Haass proposals is grappling with that, and we don't see that truth and justice are incompatible things, that you can't have one without the other. We think processes can be put in place that allow the avenue of justice and then also allow for facilitation of truth, be that through a different mechanism or a different process.
In our experiences, again, vast majority do not want prosecution, but I think it's important to know that if a family does, that avenue should be given up. But I would just reference the slide that Ann had put up before, and you saw that everything was connected. Sadly, during that time of the Troubles, it wasn't hard to find a killer. People would go kill. It's more important to find out who gave them the guns that were connected, who allowed the policy of collusion to go on. I would offer, maybe not cynically, that the British government would love to see more gunmen put on trial, because that would just delay the process more and more, and it would enable them not to really take a look at their full role in the conflict.
Yes, please, sir.
There was brief mention made in the opening remarks about Northern Ireland being used as an example for Colombia and other situations of conflict around the world. Looking at Northern Ireland and the UK, there is at least a fairly robust civil society and some standard of government transparency and accountability. Looking at the world today, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, Iraq, possibly Libya, just in one region of the world, there are ample examples of societies in which those same standards aren't in place, and a generation or two or three down the road, a similar process will have to come into being. How, in the absence of whatever advantages Northern Ireland and the UK have had, can we suggest that that system be possibly modified or adapted for a very different political and social context?
I have to say, when I see that some of our politicians are being jetted off and feted in other parts of the world and asked for their views on how societies such as those you've listed can benefit from their experience, I reach for the sick bucket in many, sorry. But because many of them who do go out there and are supposed to be giving other countries their words of wisdom, were the very politicians that I know only too well were obstacles to peace in Northern Ireland. I think that Northern Ireland is being held up possibly wrongly as an example. We certainly have a long way to go. As you say, our troubles, our conflict was, compared to many other parts of the world, should have been solvable many years ago. It's an appalling indictment on both the British and Irish governments and on our own leaders in Northern Ireland that it wasn't solved many decades ago, that it ever took place at first is an indictment. And I really don't like to see them jetting around the place, giving the benefit of their words to other places. I suppose the basic bottom line is, if you have a problem with your neighbour, talk to them. Don't kill them. But outside of that, I don't see we have much to offer.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Mine would be great. I think actually you referenced the civil society, and I actually think that would be somewhere. I mean, in Northern Ireland, it's rich, it's robust. The organisations that are sat here have done phenomenal work working with victims, with families, in terms of support, in terms of accessing truth and doing those sorts of things. So I think certainly the work of the civil society in Northern Ireland would be something that I think others should look to and learn from. The flip side of that is the civil society have had to do all of this work because the government has not put into place proper mechanisms and have not put into place proper support for victims and families. So you have an incredibly strong, robust,
but
amazing...
the whole point of rebelling against tyranny is to achieve a situation where you've got the rule of law based on human rights. So if you're talking about situations where you've got, say, failed states or circumstances where there is not open democracy and so on, the goal is still the same. And insofar as we have come a long way in Northern Ireland, with a long way to go, then I think it's right and proper to say that a human rights-based framework can help divided societies and is the only alternative to rebellion, chaos and anarchy. And that's the direction of travel, whether you're in Rwanda, Cambodia, Egypt, Syria, or wherever. That's the direction of travel we need to be facing in.
So I think given the time, I'm just going to say some concluding remarks. I'm struck by the word model, and there are probably a lot of ways in which we could think about that word. So I'm struck in the way that there's tremendous hope and success and achievement in many ways in parties coming together and making a commitment and making a compromise and committing to build a shared future together, in which parties can move forward to attempt through political means to achieve their political and national aspirations about what that jurisdiction will look like in the long run. At the same time, the implementation process and the development of a stable, socially reconstructed, equal democratic society is a journey. And so we're seeing, another way to look at that is we're seeing the playing out of that. It's a model of how hard that work is, and the support externally to make sure that human rights abuses don't continue, that the lack of attention to them, that injustice doesn't continue. And it sounds like we're hearing a resounding articulation of the importance of dealing with the past in a comprehensive and human rights compliant way as part of implementing peace and the creation of a just society. So maybe there are additional ways we can also talk about what a model is, including the struggle around that. I guess just to conclude, it sounds very clear like there's a request and a belief and a hope that the United States will continue to play the important role that it has played. We have 2 of the 5 parties that have signed up for Haass. What is the next step? What roles can the U.S. and other friends of the jurisdiction of the North play? And also attention particularly to the roles of governments. So I want to thank again for our audience for coming, for our distinguished experts for speaking, and the Commission for hosting us. Thank you.